Okay, this screencast is kind of picking up with the beginning of the War of 1812, and so if you already learned about this in class, please fast forward to the part of the notes where you are at. So, one of the earliest battles fought in the War of 1812 was at the capital city, Washington, D.C. The British were able to successfully burn much of the city, winning this battle. But one important event that takes place at this battle is that Dolly Madison, the First Lady, is able to save successfully the famous portrait seen in the picture of George Washington. It was just kind of a heroic effort by her, and the portrait now hangs, I believe, in one of the Smithsonian museums. Now, once the British take Fort McHenry, they advance into Maryland. Once they take D.C., they advance into Maryland, and we see the Battle of Fort McHenry, fought in Baltimore. Now, the Americans are able to hold off the British in this battle, so the Americans win the battle at Fort McHenry. And it is here that Francis Scott Key writes an important poem called The Star-Spangled Banner, which will later become our national anthem. So, the battle at Fort McHenry is technically what produces our current national anthem. Now, overall, y'all, it very much looks like the Americans are going to lose this war. The Federalists are not very supportive of this war at all. And they are actually going to hold a meeting in Connecticut called the Hartford Convention, where they start talking about potentially reforming U.S. government to prevent like a war at this scale of happening again. Some of them even talk about secession potentially. But lucky for the Americans, even though England was likely to win this war, they have to give up fighting because they're just depleted of their resources and they're very distracted with conflicts they have in Europe. And so it's the British that choose to not fight the remainder of the war. And so we go into a treaty. Now, this makes the Federalists look very unpopular and unpatriotic, and pretty much the whole Federalist Party is going to fall apart after this war. Their leader, Alexander Hamilton, is dead, and they just don't have really a lot of success anymore. And so we're going to, for a brief while, have just the Democratic-Republican Party. We see that the treaty that ends officially the War of 1812 is the Treaty of Ghent. It is decided that there's not going to be any like territory shifts or anything. Like no one's going to gain extra land or anything, but England officially is going to evacuate all the American forts, and things are officially better with England. Thank goodness. Okay, so our relations with England are only going to improve from here. The war is over. We see, though, one more battle fought in the war, because unfortunately, down in the South in New Orleans, they hadn't gotten word yet that the war was over and that the treaty had been signed. And so Andrew Jackson leads the Americans successfully into battle in the Battle of New Orleans. Again, just a few weeks after the treaty was signed, because word hadn't made it that far south yet. It's a huge victory for the American army, and Jackson emerges as a hero, especially in New Orleans, which is why we have the Jackson Square Memorial today with him on the horse in the quarter. Okay, one last thing about James Madison's presidency is that 20-year charter for the First National Bank had ended, so it is up for renewal, and Madison decides to continue the National Bank for a second 20-year charter. James Monroe is the fifth and final president we will talk about in our notes. He was, again, a Democratic-Republican, obviously, since the Federalist Party is now kind of doomed. And many people refer to his presidency as the era of good feelings. And this is because the Federalist Party has kind of fallen apart, and so Americans are all kind of united under one single political party system, brief unity. Also, relations with England have never been better. So things are, we're really not in a whole lot of international conflict. And there's just a strong sense of American pride, which is awesome. We're going to see the second two-party system develop in the next chapter, though. An important Supreme Court case decision was made during this time of James Monroe's presidency, and that is McCulloch versus Maryland. The legislature in Maryland imposed an annual tax on the branch of the National Bank that was located in Baltimore. So the National Bank obviously had its main branch location in D.C., but there were several bank branches kind of scattered throughout the states, and one of those branches was located in Baltimore, and Maryland is taxing that branch. This is a state government taxing a federal institution, which it thought it could do. But the National Bank says that the states can't institute a federal institution because that would imply that state powers are supreme over federal, and that's just not the case. Maryland says we can because your branch is located within our state's borders. But the issue eventually was brought to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court found favor with the bank, saying that actually because the National Bank, even though it was located, this branch was located in the state of Maryland, because the National Bank is a national institution, the states don't get to tax it. This is significant because it really asserts the authority of the federal government over state governments, even in matters within the states physically themselves. If you have questions about that, because I know I'm going fast, let me know tomorrow. Now, John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, and he is Monroe's Secretary of State. He will become known as the Great Negotiator because he is able to successfully negotiate multiple treaties for James Monroe. The first treaty is the Rush-Bagot Treaty, R-U-S-H hyphen capital B-A-G-O-T. This was a treaty signed between the United States and Great Britain. Both countries agreed to reduce the number of military vessels or ships they had in the Great Lakes, which are the bodies of water in the Midwest, kind of like northern Midwest by Michigan and Wisconsin, that border Canada and America. So those lakes are possessed partially by both Canada and America. So both countries, England and the States, had naval ships in the lakes, and basically they're saying, well, we don't need to have as many ships because we're not going to war again anytime soon. The second thing he negotiated was the 49th parallel. The 49th parallel is established as the northern border of the Louisiana Purchase. Again, argued between the United States and Britain, kind of between the Canadian territory and the U.S. territory. The Adams-Onis Treaty, Adams-O-N-I-S, this was negotiated between the U.S. and Spain, where we purchased the rest of Spanish Florida for $5 million. It also established the western border of the Louisiana Purchase, dividing what is U.S. territory and Spanish territory. Lastly, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is obviously named after President Monroe himself, but it was written by John Quincy Adams. It announced that European nations were no longer allowed to colonize or interfere in the Western Hemisphere. Basically, the U.S. is kind of emerging as the dominant superpower of our region in the West. And it basically said that if any other European country attempts to kind of colonize or come into our region, we would try to stop them. And it also said we are going to remain neutral on matters in Europe. So we're not going to get involved in matters happening outside of our region. We are really becoming the leader of the Western Hemisphere, and we are asserting ourselves as isolated from international affairs, but that will not last forever. And that is finally the end of these Chapter 6 notes. Please write down any questions you may have, and I will see you all tomorrow.